everyone. In this video, we are going to learn about some of the adaptations posed by flowering plants in order to promote cross-pollination. So the first adaptation is unisexuality. Unisexuality is also called dichogamy. Now we all know that flowering plants, they possess flower, and flower are the reproductive organs in angiosperms. So these flowers, they might contain both the male and female reproductive organs, or they might contain any one of them. Okay. So if the flower contains either a male or female reproductive organ in them, so that particular flower is known as unisexual flower. Okay. So some of the plants, they possess only unisexual flower, and this somehow promotes cross-pollination, because this is obvious. If a flower will have only one sex organ, that is either stamen or pistil. Okay, so if the flower will have only one particular sex organ, then obviously the flower has to perform cross-pollination. And the example of this is corn, papaya, cucumber, etc. Okay, if the flower is having only male reproductive organ called stamen, then the flower is known as staminate. And if the flower is having female reproductive organ called pistil, then the flower is known as pistillate. Okay. The second adaptation is dichogamy. Okay. Dichogamy. Okay. So here di means two. Okay. Dichogamy means in case of bisexual flowers, that means the flower which has both stamen and pistil. Okay. So in case of bisexual flowers, the maturation of anther and the maturation of stigma, or you can say the maturation of male and female sex organs, occurs at different time. Okay. So for example, if in a flower, if the anther matures first, so from anther, even if the pollen grain falls in the stigma, no pollination will occur. Okay. Why? Because the stigma is right now, it's like, it's immature, or it is underdeveloped, and it is not yet ready for the process of pollination. Okay. So in dichogamy, what happens is the maturation of male and female sex organs occur at different times. Okay. In any of the bisexual flower. Now, if in a flower, if in this bisexual flower, if anthers develop or matures first, this is called protandrous. Okay, what it is called? Protandrous. Okay, and the example is cotton, okra, saliva, etc. And if the stigma or the female reproductive organ matures first, it is called protogynous. Okay, so protandrous and protogynous. And the example of protogynous is pearl millet, apple, fig, etc. Okay, so here you can see this is apple flower. Okay, and in this apple flower we have stigma as well as anther. Okay, both male and female reproductive organs are present, and this one is cotton flower. In the center you can make out this stigma, style and ovary, and there are so many anthers and filament. The number of stamens are more compared to the number of pistil. Third adaptation is heterostyly. Okay, now here the meaning of this term hetero is different. Okay, and styly means style. We have three parts of pistil: stigma, style and ovary. So heterostyly means different styles. Okay, and how or in what way they are different? In this type of adaptation, this can be seen in the bisexual flowers. Okay, this type of adaptation can be seen in the bisexual flower, and in this type of adaptation, the length of the style is different in different flowers of the same species. Okay, remember this. It is a condition in flowering plant in which the flowers of the same species, okay, flowers of the same species, they have styles of different lengths. Okay, so flowers of same species, they have styles of different lengths. Okay, so that stigma is positioned either below anther or above anther in different flowers. Okay, now the first example is primrose. Okay, this is a typical primrose flower. Okay, it is actually from the top. This is the top view, and this one is like, from the bottom. This is the bottom view. Okay, now if you look here, actually, for example, this is a thalamus. Okay, so there is one condition in which the style is very long. Okay, stigma, style and ovary, this we know. And from here, the stamen is arising. stamen is arising, and you can check these anthers. Okay, so these anthers here, even if they'll produce pollen grains, it will not reach or it will not fall on the stigma, because stigma's position is up in the, it's actually high in the flower. Okay, and then maybe in the second flower, okay, in any other flower of the same species, the size of the stigma or the size of the style is lesser. It's the size of the style is smaller, and the size of the anther, I mean the size of the stamen, is longer. Okay, you can check here in the picture. This is stigma. Okay, you can see such a long style, and deep down we have ovary, and these are the anther one. Okay, anther and filament. So in this first flower, the stigma is positioned much above or much higher than the anthers. Okay, and here in the second flower, you can check this is stigma, style, and ovary. Okay, and this one is anthers. These are the anthers. Okay, and in the second type of flower, the anthers are positioned much higher or above than the stigma. Okay, so this promotes cross pollination. How? Because if in the first type of flower, if stigma is positioned very high, so obviously there are more chances of receiving pollen grains from the another flower. Okay, because it is positioned much higher above the anther, and it is in the direct contact with the air. And in this case, if the anthers are positioned much above than the stigma, pollen grains will be produced, and this would be easily noticeable by the insects. Okay, they will come sit on the flower and carry these pollen grains to the different flower. Hence, this type of arrangement, that is heterostyly, promotes cross pollination. Okay, and one more point to be noted here is this first type of flower where the style is longer compared to the filament. Okay, the stigma is positioned much above than the anther and filament. So such type of flower is known as pin flower. Okay, and the second one is called thumb flower. So pin and thumb flower. Okay, in thumb flower, the anther is positioned much above compared to the stigma, and the length of the style is shorter. There's one more example of oxalis flower. This is the thumb flower of oxalis, and this one is the pin flower. In pin flower, uh, you can check here, these are the styles. Okay, so this is stigma. Okay, and this yellow color is one is anther and filament. Okay, so in pin flower, the style's length is longer and stigma is positioned up in the air. And in thumb flower, the style length is shorter. Okay, you can make out here this is style, and here you have stigma. Okay, these are the stigma, and this one is stamens. Okay, anther and filament. Okay, the next adaptation is prepotency. Okay, the meaning of this term prepotency is, for example, this is thalamus. On the top of this thalamus, you have stigma, style, and ovary. Okay, so the meaning of term prepotency is you have two pollen grains, for example. Okay, one pollen grain is from the same flower. Okay, and one pollen grain is from any other flower of the same species. Okay, so what happens is, if for example, for the first if for example, first if the pollen grain of the same flower will fall on the stigma, the stigma will understand that, it will notice that, and it will not allow the germination of its own pollen grain. Okay, and if by chance the pollen grain from another flower falls on the stigma can easily notice that, understand that, and it will allow the germination of tube. Okay, for germination of pollen grain, and it will help in the formation of pollen tube. Okay, now for example, this stigma never receives the pollen grain from any other flower. Okay, it never receives the pollen grain from any other flower for promoting cross pollination. So what happens is, at last the stigma will finally allow the germination of pollen grain of its own flower. Okay, and this can be found in plants like apple, peach, grapes, etc. Next adaptation is self-incompatibility. self incompatibility is almost like, similar to prepotency. Again, this is the thalamus, okay, and then you have ovary, stigma and style. Okay. Now what happens is, for example, the stigma, if it is receiving the pollen grain of its own flower, okay, so this pollen grain will never germinate in the stigma of its own flower, okay, of the same flower. This is because this stigma and the style actually inhibits the formation, or it actually inhibits the formation or growth of pollen tube inside the style. Okay. So if the pollen grain of any other flower of the same species will fall on it, it will definitely lead to the for germination of pollen grain and formation of pollen tube, and finally the fertilization of the egg cell. Okay. So self incompatibility is a condition where pollen is not able to fertilize the same flower or the other flower on the same plant. Okay, due to inhibition of growth of the pollen tube in stigma and style, thereby preventing delivery of male gametes to the ovule. Okay, and this can be found in potato and tobacco. So this prepotency and self-incompatibility is almost same. The only difference is in prepotency actually ensures reproduction. Okay, in case of prepotency, if no pollen grain has been received by the stigma from the another flower, so it will ensure reproduction by allowing the pollen grain of the same flower to germinate. Okay, but in case of self incompatibility, it do not ensure reproduction. This is because if the stigma will never receive pollen grain from any other flower, okay, if it will not never receive pollen grain from any other flower of the same species, then the stigma will never allow germination of the pollen grain of the same species, okay, of pollen grain of the same flower. Okay. So prepotency ensures reproduction, but in incompatibility, reproduction is just a chance factor. If pollen grain of another flower will fall on it, it will help in germination. And the example is potato and tobacco. Next adaptation is this suppression of one sex in the flower. Okay. So in most of the bisexual flowers, okay, there are some bisexual flowers in which both male and female gametes are present. Okay. So in these bisexual flowers, what happens is any one reproductive organ, either male or female, would be functional and another one would be non-functional. Okay. And then last adaptation for cross-pollination is Herkogamy. Okay. Now Herkogamy is actually a spatial separation of stigma and anther in bisexual flowers. Okay. This is important. There are bisexual flowers in which both male and female reproductive organs are present. So these male and female reproductive organs, that is anther and stigma, are actually separated from each other by the presence of any mechanical or physical barrier. Okay, this is important. There is a presence of any mechanical or physical barrier. Okay, now how it happens is sometimes the stigma. Okay, for example, if this is the stigma, style and ovary, so the stigma is generally covered with a hood-like structure. Okay, the stigma is generally covered with a hood-like structure, okay, in the flower, so that pollen grain finds it very difficult to reach the stigma of the same flower, and this prevents self-pollination. Okay, and in case of anthers, what happens is anthers, they release pollen grains in a bag-like structure. Okay, you can check here. There is a plant called calotropis. Okay, so anthers, they release pollen grains in a bag-like structure. Okay, and this bag is known as pollinium. What this bag is called? Pollinium. Okay, so there is a bag-like structure. This bag is known as pollinium, and inside this we have these pollen grains. Okay, now even if this pollinium will fall on the stigma, stigma is not in direct contact with the pollen grains, and hence this prevents the germination. And later on, this pollinium can be carried away either by insects or any other factor. Okay, this yellow structure actually shows the pollinium of one of the bisexual flower, and this one you can make out, this is the hood-like structure. Okay, under this hood-like structure, the stigma is present. Okay, so we are done with the adaptations of flowering plant in order to promote cross pollination. From next video onwards, we are going to discuss about the adaptations of these flowering plants or these flowers in order to promote wind pollination, insect pollination and water pollination. Okay, so we will learn that what are the characteristics of these flowers which actually favors wind pollination and water pollination and insect pollination.